Huh. The moment my daughter pressed her thumb into my palm twice, quick and deliberate, I almost missed it. We were sitting at the Thanksgiving table. Her, me, my wife Patricia, and the man she'd been seeing for the past 5 months, a man named Connor Miles, who was explaining to my brother-in-law why the traditional stock market was, in his words, a retirement trap designed to keep the middle class running in place. I was cutting my turkey. I kept cutting it. But my hand registered what my ears had already started cataloging. 2 presses. Firm. The way she used to do it when she was 9 years old and wanted me to get her out of something without making it a scene. My name is Warren Holt. I'm 58 years old. I spent 19 years as a senior investigator with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit out of the Chicago field office, and another 7 years after that consulting for the FDIC on bank fraud and elder financial exploitation cases. My daughter's name is Mara. She's 29, and she had just used a signal we invented when she was in 3rd grade after her dance recital ran 2 hours long, and she was trapped next to a woman who smelled like mothballs and wanted to discuss every single routine in detail. From that night on, 2 presses meant, I need you. Quietly. She hadn't used it in 11 years. I looked at her across the table. She was smiling at something Connor had just said, laughing at the right moment. Her wine glass held comfortably in her other hand. She looked relaxed. She always had a good read on a room, my daughter. She got that from her mother. But she had pressed my hand twice. Connor was still talking. He had a voice that carried just enough confidence to fill a room without seeming to try. He was 38, worked in what he called private capital advisory, dressed well without overdoing it, and had, since arriving that afternoon, managed to touch on real estate, commodities, interest rate cycles, and the Federal Reserve's monetary policy, all in the natural flow of dinner conversation. It hadn't felt like a pitch. That was the thing. It felt like a man who simply knew a lot and enjoyed sharing it. Patricia was watching me from the other end of the table the way she does when she knows I'm doing a calculation behind my eyes that I don't want visible on my face. She excused herself to check on the pie. Mara offered to help her. That left me alone with Connor and my brother-in-law Ted, who had already had 2 glasses of wine and was now asking Connor follow-up questions with the enthusiasm of a man who wanted to seem financially sophisticated at Thanksgiving. Connor was patient with him. Generous, even. He had the particular warmth of someone who knew how to make a person feel like the smartest guy in the room while moving the conversation exactly where he wanted it to go. I asked him how long he'd been in private capital. About 6 years, he said. Started in commercial lending, moved into alternative structures when he saw how much value was getting left on the table for average investors. He said it the way people say things they've said many times before. Practiced but not robotic, easy in the mouth. What kind of alternative structures? I asked. He smiled. Real estate syndications, private credit, energy royalties, things that institutional investors have been using for decades, he said, but that most financial advisors don't talk about because they can't earn a commission on them. I nodded. That night, after Connor and Mara left, Patricia came and stood beside me at the kitchen sink while I rinsed plates. She didn't say anything for a moment. He's very smooth, she said finally. I dried my hands and looked at her. She knows the difference between me being quiet because I'm tired and me being quiet because I'm working something out. After 32 years of marriage, there's no version of my face she hasn't already translated. She pressed my hand, I said. The old signal. Patricia set down the dish she was holding. We talked for 40 minutes that night. Or I talked. She listened the way she always does when I'm organizing something out loud. Not interrupting, not redirecting, just making it easier for me to hear my own thinking. The next morning, I texted Mara and asked if I could come by. She lived 20 minutes away in a 2-bedroom apartment she'd rented since her breakup 2 years ago. When she opened the door, she was still in her robe, coffee in hand, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a teenager and had something hard to tell me. I already knew she was going to tell me he'd moved in. 6 weeks ago, she said. She looked down at her mug. His lease ended and he said he needed a couple months to find the right place, and I wanted him to stay. So I said yes. Okay, I said. I kept my voice even. When did he start talking to you about money? She looked up. About 3 weeks in. He said I was too smart to have my savings sitting in a target date fund. that he could show me how to restructure my IRA into something with real growth. He said my financial advisor was collecting fees for doing nothing that a spreadsheet couldn't do. How much are we talking about? She met my eyes. I have about $68,000 in my IRA. She paused. And I've been contributing to a 403b through work for 4 years. That's another $31,000. I sat with that. Has he shown you anything specific? She went to her laptop and pulled up an email. She turned it toward me. It was a document called an investment summary for something called the Meridian Horizon Capital Fund. It looked clean, professional typeface, a letterhead with a registered address in Denver, Colorado, a graph showing 7 years of returns averaging between 14 and 19% annually, a 2-page section on investor protections. How long do you have to decide? She scrolled to the bottom of the email. He said the next entry period closes on the 30th, end of the month. That was 12 days away. He doesn't know what I did, I said. I told him you were retired FBI, she said quietly. He said that was impressive. He said it like it was just information, like it didn't change anything about what he was doing. I'd heard that particular tone before. Not in a good way. Has he asked you to sign anything yet? Not sign. But he emailed me a subscription form last week. Said there was no pressure, just wanted me to have it. Said if I had questions, he had a colleague who could walk me through it on a call, a third party to validate the pitch. That was a detail I recognized. Forward me that email, I said. Both of them. Tonight, if you can. She looked at me carefully. Dad, I know what you're thinking. She looked at me carefully. Dad, I know what you're thinking. Tell me what I'm thinking, I said. She turned her coffee mug in her hands. You're thinking something is very wrong. You're not just here because I pressed your hand. You're here because you already know what that signal meant. I looked at my daughter, this person who had inherited her mother's instincts and her father's ability to read a room, who had pressed my hand at a dinner table and trusted that it would mean the same thing it meant 20 years ago. And I said, "You're right. I need you to let me look at the documents. That's all I'm asking right now." She nodded. The email she forwarded me that night took me 90 minutes to go through. The Meridian Horizon Capital Fund was described as a private real estate and credit vehicle operating under Regulation D of the Securities Act of 1933, which allows certain investment offerings to be sold to accredited investors without full SEC registration. That part was technically accurate as a legal structure. What it meant in practice was that the fund was operating in a space with significantly less regulatory oversight than a publicly registered fund. The address in Denver, when I looked it up, was a registered agent office. A pass-through, not a real place of business. The performance chart cited no independent auditor. This section on investor protections mentioned something called the Meridian Capital Investor Security Program, which was referenced but not defined anywhere in the attached documents, and no link was provided. The fund's stated strategy involved acquiring discounted commercial real estate through private credit facilities secured by hard assets. The hard assets were not identified. There was no schedule of collateral. There was no list of existing properties. There was nothing that would allow anyone, not a lawyer, not an accountant, not a regulator, to verify that any underlying asset actually existed. It was a frame. A very professional, very expensive-looking frame with nothing inside it. I had 2 people I could call. The first was a man named Gerald Ashworth, who had been a forensic accountant for the Department of Justice in Washington for 18 years before moving into private practice. We'd worked parallel tracks on a pension fund fraud case out of St. Louis. Louis in 2014 and I trusted his eye more than almost anyone I knew. The second was a woman named Renata Cruz, who ran the investment fraud unit at the Illinois Securities Department. We'd crossed paths on multiple cases over the years. She owed me nothing, and I owed her nothing. And we had always respected each other exactly that way. I texted them both that night. Gerald called me at 8 the next morning. I read him sections of the subscription form over the phone. When I got to the part about the hard asset collateral, he stopped me. "Read that again," he said. I read it again. He was quiet for a moment. "Gordon, there's no description of what the assets actually are. None at all. In a legitimate private credit fund, you'd have a schedule. You'd see the properties, the valuations, the LTV ratios. There's nothing here. It's aspirational language. If the fund claimed the assets depreciated or a credit facility defaulted, there would be no way to independently confirm anything ever existed in the first place. I already knew that, but hearing it from Gerald made it real in a different way. Renata called at 9:40. "He's real," she said, meaning Connor, and I recognized the particular flatness in her voice that meant the situation was not simple. Connor Miles, 38, grew up in Columbus, studied finance at Ohio State, worked 4 years at a mid-size wealth management firm in Cincinnati before the firm terminated him. They filed a complaint with FineRay. The complaint is closed, but the record exists. What was it for? Unauthorized movement of client funds into an unapproved private placement. The client was a widow, 72 years old. She lost $58,000. She declined to cooperate with a full investigation. Her son handled most of the contact, and eventually the family just wanted it to go away. There it was, the same architecture, smaller scale. A rehearsal. He'd refined it, moved to a new market, and applied it again with more confidence. Is Meridian Horizon Capital registered anywhere? No. There is no registered entity by that name with the SEC, FineRay, or any state securities regulator I can find, so this is straight fraud. It appears to be. The question is whether we can build enough before the end of the month. These operators move fast, Gordon. They have clean digital profiles, minimal physical presence, and when they feel pressure, they disappear. I've seen it happen in 48 hours. What do you need from me? I need your daughter to agree to one more meeting with him. I need him on audio, making the full pitch, asking for a commitment, providing account or wire transfer information. In Illinois, you can record a conversation you're a party to without disclosure. If Mara records it herself, on her own phone in her own apartment, that recording is usable. I drove to Mara's apartment the next afternoon. She was waiting for me. She had changed out of her work clothes and was sitting on the couch with her knees pulled up, her laptop open on the coffee table, and she looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was 12 years old and something at school had gone sideways and she was deciding how much to say. I sat across from her and told her everything. The Denver address that was a mail forwarding service, Gerald's analysis of the subscription agreement, the missing collateral schedule, the FineRay complaint in Cincinnati, the widow who lost $58,000 and whose family didn't pursue it because they were embarrassed. Mara sat very still through all of it. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "He told me I was the first person he'd ever met who made him want to stop moving around so much." She said it quietly, not with anger, with the particular kind of stillness that comes when something you trusted turns out to have a completely different shape than you thought it did. "There's nothing I can say that makes that land any differently," I said. "You have to sit with it." She looked out the window. After a while she said, "What do I need to do?" I explained the recording. I explained that she would need to let him make the full pitch. Let him name the amount, describe the fund, walk through the wire transfer process. She needed to ask reasonable questions, not tip him off, not give him any reason to think anything had shifted. She needed to seem like a woman who was almost ready to say yes. "Can you do that?" I asked. She looked at me with those eyes she'd had since she was a kid, the ones that didn't look away from hard things. "I've been telling myself for 3 weeks that I was overreacting," she said. "That it was fine, that I was just being paranoid because of how the last relationship ended." "You weren't overreacting," I said. She exhaled slowly. "Yeah, Dad. I can sit across from him." She called him that evening and told him she'd been thinking seriously about the investment summary and she wanted to sit down and go through a few things before she committed. She said she wanted to understand it properly, not just read through documents on her own. He suggested dinner at her apartment on Wednesday. Casual, he said. He'd bring food. She texted me after she hung up. He sounded pleased. Not surprised. Pleased. Like it was going exactly the way he expected. That detail stayed with me. Wednesday morning I drove to Mara's apartment. We sat at her kitchen table and I walked her through it, phone in the front pocket of her cardigan. Voice memo app running before he arrived. Let him talk. Don't rush. If he paused, let the silence be his to fill. People fill silence with exactly what they're trying to hide or exactly what they're trying to sell. Ask neutral clarifying questions. Don't be eager. Don't be resistant. Be someone who is 2 steps away from signing. How are you feeling? I asked. She thought about it. Steady, she said. The kind of steady that comes from deciding something. That's the right kind, I said. I went home. Patricia and I sat in the kitchen and she made tea and I looked at my phone and we didn't talk much. She put on the radio. The kind of waiting that doesn't need to be explained. Mara texted me at 7:44. Done. He said everything. Calling you when he leaves. She called me at 8:20. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the effort in it. The kind of steady that costs something to maintain. She told me what he had said. The Meridian Horizon Fund, she said, was projecting returns of 15 to 21% annually. He had explained that these were conservative estimates based on the fund's existing positions, which he described as primarily distressed commercial real estate in secondary markets. Mid-sized cities where institutional buyers hadn't moved in yet. He had named an account number at an online bank headquartered in Nevada and explained that the fund managers operated outside traditional banking infrastructure because, as he put it, the big banks slow everything down and take their cut at every step. Her money, he told her, would be working within 96 hours of the wire transfer clearing. He told her the preferred allocation threshold was $50,000. If she could commit at that level, she'd get a better entry rate. She had asked him, in exactly the tone we'd rehearsed, what would happen if she needed access to the money before the fund's stated 36-month hold period. He said the fund had a hardship provision. He said it with complete smoothness. There is no fund, I said. I know, she said. I called Renata that night. She asked Mara to send the audio file to a secure drop address. Mara did it within the hour. Renata called me the next morning. It's there, she said. All of it. Wire instructions, the pitch, the return projections, the 96-hour language. We're moving. I didn't ask about the mechanics of how it unfolded. That wasn't my role anymore. What I know is that Connor Miles was taken into custody at Mara's apartment on Friday morning at 7:15 before she had left for work, and I know because she called me while it was happening, standing outside her own front door in the November cold, and she said very quietly, "Dad, they're inside. He's still in there. It's happening. Go put on your coat," I said. Go downstairs, get some air. The investigation that followed established that Connor had run versions of the same scheme across 3 states in the preceding 4 years. The Meridian Horizon Capital Fund was one of 2 fraudulent vehicles investigators identified. Total losses across confirmed victims, 6 individuals, exceeded $740,000. Most of them had never reported it. Most of them had been too ashamed. Mara was the first victim in his current cycle who hadn't transferred a dollar. 3 weeks later, Mara came for Sunday dinner. Just the 3 of us this time. Patricia made her pot roast, the one Mara has asked for since she was tall enough to see over the counter. We sat at the same table where 5 weeks earlier, a man had been carefully, methodically building toward the moment he would have asked my daughter to wire him everything she'd saved. Mara was quieter than usual through most of dinner. Not the anxious quiet from the weeks before, something different, settled. The kind that comes after something difficult is finally over. She helped Patricia with the dishes without being asked, which she's done since she was old enough to stand at the sink. When Patricia went to call her sister, Mara came and sat across from me with both hands around her glass of water. I keep asking myself why I didn't just end it the moment something felt off, she said. Because you were inside it, I said. That's the whole design. She looked at her glass. It didn't feel like manipulation. It felt like a relationship. I know. How do people do this? How do they... She stopped. How do they build something real and use it like that? I've spent a long time thinking about that question, I said. The answer is that it isn't despite the realness. It's because of it. The best financial predators don't fake the warmth. They feel it, or some version of it, long enough to make you feel it back. The relationship is the instrument, not a cover for the crime. The actual instrument. By the time the financial conversation starts, you're already inside something that has its own weight, its own history. Saying no to the investment means saying no to all of it, and most people can't do that. They wait. They rationalize, and while they're waiting, the money moves and the person is already somewhere else with a different name on a lease. Mara was quiet. You didn't wait, I said. That matters more than you know. Most people feel the wrongness and talk themselves out of it. They're embarrassed. They don't want to seem foolish. They don't want the person to be what they're turning out to be. So they wait one more week. And the window closes. She looked up. I almost waited. But you didn't. You pressed my hand. She smiled at that. Small and real. We sat for a while with the sound of Patricia laughing on the phone in the other room, and the heat coming on in the baseboards the way it does when the temperature drops outside. Eventually, Patricia came back and we moved to the living room and found an old movie none of us had seen, and we sat there, the three of us, Patricia falling asleep in the armchair before the third act, and it was just an ordinary evening at home. After everything, that felt like exactly the right thing to be. There are things I want to say clearly, as someone who spent the better part of 2 decades watching this happen to real people. Fraud like this works not because victims are naive, but because they are open. Open to connection, open to the possibility of good things, open, in many cases, to a relationship they genuinely wanted to be real. The most effective financial predators don't select for ignorance. They select for emotional availability. They are patient in a way that almost no one else is patient. They build something genuine, dinners, laughter, the texture of an actual life together, before they make a single financial suggestion. By the time the investment comes up, the victim isn't evaluating an investment. They're evaluating whether to trust someone they already love. The red flags are almost always visible only from the outside, or in retrospect. Annual return projections above 10 to 12%, offered consistently and confidently, should prompt serious questions. Legitimate private investments can outperform public markets, but anyone guaranteeing double-digit returns without a detailed, audited track record is selling you a story, not a fund. A fund that cannot be verified through FINRA's BrokerCheck, the SEC's Investment Advisor Public Disclosure Database, or your state's securities regulator should be treated as unregistered until proven otherwise. These searches take 5 minutes and cost nothing. A business address that turns out to be a registered agent service, a mail forwarding office that charges a monthly fee and lists hundreds of businesses at the same street address is not a business. It is an appearance of a business. Urgency around a deadline, a closing window, a preferred allocation that expires. Real private investments have entry criteria, but manufactured scarcity is one of the oldest tools in this playbook. Resistance to allowing an independent attorney or CPA to review documents before you commit. Anyone who discourages a second set of professional eyes is not protecting you. They are protecting themselves. In the United States, you can verify any investment advisor or broker through FINRA BrokerCheck at brokercheck.finra.org. You can look up any registered investment fund through the SEC's EDGAR database at sec.gov. If a fund has no registration, no auditor, and no verifiable history, it doesn't matter how professional the PDF looks. The presentation is the product. The fund is not. And this finally, and I mean this as plainly as I know how to say it, if someone in your life reaches out to you, in whatever way they have, with whatever signal you share, please listen. Mara used a hand signal we invented for a third grader's problem. She used it because something in her, something below the level of conscious reasoning, had already registered that she needed someone outside the situation. That instinct is not paranoia. It is information. It is the most important information you will ever receive about a situation you are too close to evaluate clearly. We didn't lose $1. The difference, in the end, was a 29-year-old woman sitting at a Thanksgiving table with her family and pressing her father's hand twice. If your gut is telling you something, it is telling you something for a reason. It always is. I've thought about that Thanksgiving dinner a lot since everything happened. Not the arrest, not the documents, not the wire transfer instructions Connor had ready on his phone. I think about the moment before any of that, Mara, sitting across from me, laughing at something he said, wine glass in her hand, looking for all the world like a woman who was exactly where she wanted to be, and underneath the table pressing my palm twice. What strikes me now is how much courage that took. Not the obvious kind of courage, not the kind that looks like courage from the outside. She wasn't certain. She wasn't sure she was right. She had spent 3 weeks telling herself she was overreacting, that she was reading things in because of old wounds, that a good man who made her feel seen was exactly what he appeared to be. And some part of her still pressed my hand anyway. That's the harder thing to do. Acting on an instinct you're not sure you can justify is harder than acting on one you're confident in. I've worked fraud cases for most of my adult life. I've sat across from people who lost their life savings, and the thing they always say, almost without exception, is that they knew, somewhere, at some level below articulation, they knew something was wrong. And they waited. They waited because they were embarrassed. They waited because they wanted to be wrong. They waited because the relationship felt real, and admitting the fraud meant admitting the relationship was a construction. And that loss was sometimes harder to face than the financial one. Mara didn't wait. That's the only reason we're sitting at a dinner table 3 weeks later watching Patricia fall asleep in her armchair. There's something I've come to believe about the way character works. Not as an abstract idea, but as a practical force in a person's life. The choices that define us aren't usually the dramatic ones. They're the small ones made under pressure when no one is watching. When the easier path is right there and completely available. Mara could have said nothing. She could have told herself she'd think about it more next week. She could have signed the subscription form and wired the money and found out the hard way. Every instinct she had pushing her toward that easier path was wrapped in something that felt like love, which makes it the hardest kind of pressure to resist. She resisted it, not because she was certain she was right, because she decided that her discomfort was worth more than her silence. That's what I want her to carry forward from this. Not the mechanics of how to spot a fraudulent fund. Not the red flags, not the FINRA database, not the registered agent addresses. Those things matter, but they're learnable any time. What I want her to hold on to is the knowledge that her instincts are an instrument worth trusting. That the small, uncomfortable feeling she talked herself out of for 3 weeks was not paranoia, not insecurity, not damage from something that happened before. It was information, accurate, reliable, hard-won information about reality. Connor Miles was good at what he did. He was patient and warm, and he said the right things at the right moments, and he had done it before, and refined it, and he would have done it again. The reason he didn't finish what he started with my daughter is not because she was smarter than his other victims, it's because she acted on what she already knew before she had proof. That's not a small thing. That's everything. We didn't lose $1, and I'll be grateful for that for the rest of my life.